Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the most intense love you've ever experienced wasn't actually love? What if the connection that keeps pulling you back again and again, no matter how much pain it causes, is not a sacred soul bond but something created by emotional wounds? This is one of the most uncomfortable questions people on the twin flame journey eventually face. Because when a connection feels overwhelming, magnetic, and impossible to forget, the easiest explanation is destiny, twin flames, soulmates, divine timing. But what if the truth is more complicated? And what if asking this question could actually set you free? When love feels like gravity, many people describe their twin flame connection in almost mystical terms. They say meeting this person felt like coming home, like recognizing someone they had known forever, like the universe itself had arranged the meeting. From the very beginning, the connection feels different from anything they have experienced before. Conversations flow effortlessly. Eye contact feels deeper than words. Even silence feels meaningful. And then something strange happens. The connection becomes intense. Not just emotionally intense, but psychologically consuming. You think about them constantly. You analyze every message. You replay every moment in your mind. If they pull away, anxiety grows. If they return, relief floods your body. The emotional highs feel euphoric. The lows feel devastating. But no matter what happens, one thing remains the same. You cannot let them go. Even when you try, even when logic tells you that you should, even when the relationship begins to hurt more than it heals, that is when the question begins to appear in the back of your mind. Is this truly a spiritual connection? Or is something else happening? The internet's favorite explanation. Over the last decade, the concept of twin flames has exploded across the internet. Thousands of videos, articles, and communities talk about the signs of twin flame connections. They describe a relationship that is deeply transformative. Two souls that mirror each other. Two halves of the same spiritual essence. According to this idea, twin flames are meant to trigger growth, awaken hidden wounds, and push each other towards spiritual evolution, which explains why the relationship often includes separation, conflict, and emotional intensity. For many people, discovering the twin flame concept feels like a revelation. Finally, there is an explanation for why the connection feels so powerful. Finally, the chaos makes sense. Finally, the pain has meaning. But here's the problem. Sometimes people use the twin flame label to justify relationships that are actually unhealthy. Instead of asking whether the connection is nurturing or destructive, they assume the pain is simply part of the journey. Instead of recognizing patterns of emotional manipulation, they interpret them as spiritual tests. And instead of walking away from harm, they stay because they believe the universe wants them to. This is where things become dangerous. Because not every intense connection is sacred. Some are something else entirely. The hidden power of emotional bonds. Human beings are wired for connection. Our brains evolved to form attachments. When we feel close to someone, powerful chemicals flood our nervous system. Oxytocin strengthens emotional bonding. Dopamine creates feelings of reward and anticipation. Adrenaline heightens emotional intensity. Together, these chemicals create the feeling we often call love. But the same system can also create something much darker. A psychological phenomenon known as a trauma bond. A trauma bond happens when emotional attachment forms within a cycle of pain and relief. Instead of stable love, the relationship becomes unpredictable. One moment there is closeness. The next moment there is distance. One day there is affection. The next day there is silence. This unpredictability creates a powerful emotional dependency. Because the brain begins to crave the return of affection. Every time the other person comes back, it feels like relief, like validation, like hope. But when they disappear again, the emotional withdrawal feels unbearable. So the cycle continues.
Pain,
Relief.
pain,
Relief. Over time, the bond becomes stronger, not weaker, which is why trauma bonds are so difficult to break. Even when the relationship is clearly harmful, even when friends and family say you should leave, even when you know deep down that something isn't right, you still feel pulled toward the person who hurt you. Not because the relationship is healthy, but because your nervous system has been conditioned to depend on it. Why the confusion happens. Now, imagine experiencing that emotional intensity for the first time. The obsession, the longing, the feeling that no one else in the world understands you like this person does. It can feel almost supernatural, almost spiritual, especially when strange coincidences begin appearing. You think about them, and they suddenly text. You see their name everywhere. You run into them unexpectedly. Moments like these reinforce the belief that the connection must be destined. But human psychology can easily create patterns that feel mystical. Our minds naturally search for meaning. We notice coincidences more when they involve people we care about. We remember emotional moments more vividly. And when our hearts are deeply invested, every sign feels significant, which makes it incredibly difficult to separate spiritual intuition from emotional dependency. Because both experiences can feel powerful, both can feel meaningful, and both can convince you that the relationship is meant to be. The question few people want to ask. This is why one of the most important questions on the twin flame journey is also the hardest. What if the connection you believe is spiritual is actually a trauma bond? What if the intensity you feel is not the recognition of a soul connection, but the echo of emotional wounds? For many people, even considering this possibility feels terrifying, because it challenges the story they have built around the relationship. It forces them to confront something painful, that the person they believe is their other half might actually be someone who triggers their deepest insecurities. But asking this question does not mean your connection is fake. And it does not mean that spiritual connections don't exist. What it means is that truth matters more than fantasy. Because the purpose of a genuine spiritual connection, if such a thing exists, is growth, awareness, healing, not confusion, not emotional destruction, and certainly not losing yourself in someone else. A journey of discernment. The reality is that some people on the twin flame path truly do experience profound soul-level connections. Connections that challenge them, transform them, and inspire deep personal growth. But others become trapped in cycles of emotional dependency that look spiritual on the surface yet are rooted in unresolved trauma. And the difference between those two experiences can be subtle, at least at first, which is why discernment is essential. Understanding your attachment patterns, recognizing emotional manipulation, learning the difference between intensity and authenticity. These are the tools that help you see clearly. Because love, real love, should not feel like a prison. It should not require you to abandon your self-worth. And it should never convince you that suffering is the price of destiny, the beginning of clarity. So before we talk about twin flames, before we analyze signs and synchronicities, before we dive into spiritual interpretations of connection, we must start with something much more grounded: understanding trauma bonds. Because once you understand how trauma bonds work, something powerful happens. The fog begins to lift, the emotional patterns start to make sense, and the connection that once felt mysterious becomes easier to see clearly. Not through the lens of fantasy, but through the lens of truth. And sometimes, truth is the first step toward freedom. If you search for the term twin flame today, you will find millions of results. Videos with titles like 10 Signs You Met Your Twin Flame. Forums filled with people describing intense emotional connections. Stories of lovers who separate, reunite, and transform each other's lives. But recently, something interesting has begun happening. A new conversation is emerging alongside the twin flame narrative. Psychologists, therapists, and even people within spiritual communities are starting to ask a difficult question. What if some of these relationships are not twin flames but trauma bonds? This question has sparked a growing debate across social media, podcasts, and mental health platforms. And the reason is simple. More people are beginning to notice that the emotional patterns described in many twin flame journeys look strikingly similar to patterns found in toxic relationships. Sudden, intense attraction, extreme emotional highs and lows, cycles of separation and reunion, one person chasing while the other runs. For some people, these patterns lead to healing and growth. But for others, they lead to confusion, emotional exhaustion, and years of waiting for someone who never truly shows up. So, why is this topic suddenly everywhere? Why are so many people questioning whether their connection is spiritual destiny or emotional trauma? To understand this shift, we need to look at how the twin flame idea became so popular in the first place. The rise of the twin flame narrative. The concept of twin flames is not entirely new. Variations of the idea have appeared in spiritual traditions for centuries. Some ancient philosophies describe souls that split into two parts, two individuals who are meant to reunite in order to become spiritually whole. Over time, modern spiritual communities expanded this concept into a detailed journey. According to popular twin flame teachings, the connection often unfolds in stages. First comes the meeting, an intense recognition that feels almost supernatural. Then comes the honeymoon phase, where everything feels perfect and aligned. But eventually, unresolved emotional wounds surface. One partner often becomes overwhelmed and pulls away. This creates the famous twin flame dynamic known as the runner and the chaser. One person runs from the intensity of the connection. The other feels compelled to pursue them. This stage can last months, sometimes years, and in many cases, people interpret this painful separation as a necessary part of spiritual awakening. Because according to the narrative, the purpose of the twin flame relationship is not simply romance. It is transformation. Both partners must confront their deepest fears, insecurities, and emotional wounds before they can reunite. On the surface, this explanation can feel deeply meaningful. It frames emotional pain as part of a larger spiritual journey. It gives purpose to confusion, and it offers hope that reunion will eventually happen. But this is where things begin to get complicated. When spiritual language meets emotional reality, the human mind has a powerful need to make sense of emotional pain. When a relationship ends abruptly or becomes unstable, we often search for explanations. Why did this happen? Why does it feel so intense? Why can't I move on? The twin flame narrative provides answers that feel comforting. Instead of seeing the relationship as unhealthy or incompatible, people reinterpret the chaos as spiritual testing. Instead of asking whether the other person is emotionally available, they assume the other person is simply the runner. Instead of accepting that the relationship may be over, they hold on to the belief that reunion is inevitable. At first, this perspective can feel empowering. It gives people a sense of meaning. It encourages self-reflection and personal growth. But sometimes it can also prevent people from seeing reality clearly. Because not every relationship that triggers deep emotions is meant to last. And not every painful dynamic is part of a divine plan. Sometimes, the intensity comes from unresolved psychological patterns rather than spiritual destiny. The psychology behind intense attachments. Psychologists have studied attachment patterns for decades. Research shows that our early childhood experiences strongly influence how we form relationships. Later in life, some people develop secure attachment styles. They feel comfortable with intimacy and trust. Others develop anxious attachment styles. They crave closeness but fear abandonment. Still others develop avoidant attachment styles. They value independence and often feel overwhelmed by emotional closeness. When an anxious person and an avoidant person form a relationship, a powerful dynamic can emerge. The anxious partner seeks reassurance and connection. The avoidant partner pulls away when things become emotionally intense. This creates a cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. One person chases, the other runs. Sound familiar? Many therapists point out that this dynamic looks almost identical to the runner-chaser pattern described in twin flame teachings. which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Some relationships labeled as twin flames might actually be examples of incompatible attachment styles interacting with each other. Instead of spiritual mirroring, the partners may simply be triggering each other's psychological defense mechanisms. The influence of online communities. Another reason this topic is gaining attention is the role of online communities. Social media platforms have made it easier than ever for people to share personal experiences. Someone going through a painful breakup might search for answers online. Within minutes, they discover videos explaining the twin flame journey. They read stories from people who describe nearly identical emotional experiences. They see comments from others who say they are waiting for reunion. And suddenly, their personal pain becomes part of a shared narrative. This sense of belonging can be incredibly comforting. It reassures people that they are not alone. But it can also reinforce certain beliefs. If everyone in the community believes separation is temporary, people may continue waiting long after the relationship has clearly ended. If everyone believes the runner will eventually return, people may ignore signs that the other person has moved on. Over time, the community itself can unintentionally strengthen emotional attachment to the relationship, even when moving on might be healthier. When waiting becomes a lifestyle, one of the most concerning patterns therapists have noticed is how long some people remain emotionally stuck in these dynamics. There are individuals who spend years, sometimes even decades, waiting for their twin flame to return. During that time, they may avoid new relationships. They may interpret every coincidence as a sign from the universe. They may believe that any attempt to move forward would disrupt divine timing. In extreme cases, people structure their entire lives around the hope of reunion. They analyze social media activity. They interpret dreams as messages. They search constantly for spiritual confirmation. From the outside, this can look less like a spiritual journey and more like emotional captivity. And that realization is part of why the conversation around trauma bonds is growing. Mental health professionals are beginning to speak openly about the similarities between certain twin flame narratives and patterns of emotional dependency, not to dismiss spiritual beliefs, but to encourage healthier boundaries and self-awareness. A necessary conversation. It is important to understand that questioning the twin flame concept does not mean dismissing spirituality. Many people have deeply meaningful relationships that inspire growth, compassion, and transformation. Human connections can indeed feel mysterious and profound, but healthy spirituality should never require ignoring psychological reality. True growth involves both emotional awareness and spiritual insight, which is why this conversation is so important. Instead of blindly labeling every intense relationship as a twin flame connection, more people are learning to ask deeper questions. Is this relationship helping me grow? Do I feel respected and valued? Am I becoming stronger or more dependent? These questions create space for clarity, and clarity is the beginning of healing, moving toward understanding. As the conversation around twin flames and trauma bonds continues to grow, one thing becomes clear. Intensity alone does not prove destiny. Strong emotions do not automatically mean spiritual connection. And pain, no matter how meaningful it feels, is not always a sign that a relationship is meant to continue. Sometimes, the most important step on any spiritual path is learning to see clearly, not just what we hope is true, but what actually is. Because the deeper you understand the psychology of attachment and emotional bonding, the easier it becomes to recognize the difference between a connection that heals you and one that keeps you trapped. And in the next chapter, we are going to explore one of the most powerful forces behind these dynamics: the hidden psychology of trauma bonds, how they form, why they feel so addictive, and why so many people mistake them for soul connections. Have you ever asked yourself a question that feels almost impossible to answer? If someone hurts me so much, why can't I walk away? Why do I still think about them every day? Why do I feel relief when they come back, even after everything that happened? For many people caught in painful relationships, this question becomes deeply personal. Friends may say, "You deserve better." Family members may warn, This relationship isn't healthy. Even logic inside your own mind may whisper the same thing, but your heart still pulls you back. Again, and again, and again. This is the confusing and powerful reality of trauma bonds. To understand why they are so difficult to break, we first need to understand how they are created. Because trauma bonds are not formed through ordinary affection. They are formed through a cycle that mixes emotional pain with emotional relief. And that cycle can become incredibly addictive. The cycle that creates the bond. At the beginning, many trauma-bonded relationships do not appear unhealthy. In fact, they often start with intense closeness. The connection feels exciting. The attention feels validating. The emotional chemistry feels powerful. In some cases, the other person may shower you with affection, compliments, or promises about the future. Psychologists sometimes call this phase love bombing. It creates a strong emotional attachment very quickly. Your brain begins associating this person with feelings of happiness, belonging, and excitement. But eventually something shifts. Communication becomes inconsistent. The warmth that once felt constant begins to disappear. Messages go unanswered. Plans get canceled. Emotional distance appears without explanation. Confusion replaces certainty. At first, you might assume something is wrong. Maybe they are stressed. Maybe they need space. Maybe you did something that upset them.
So you try harder to reconnect.
But then something surprising happens. After a period of distance, the other person returns. They may apologize. They may show affection again. They may promise that things will be different. And when that affection returns, it feels incredibly powerful. Almost euphoric. Relief floods your body. The anxiety disappears. And the connection feels stronger than ever. But eventually, the pattern repeats. Distance.
Pain.
Reunion. Relief. Distance again. Over time, this cycle strengthens the emotional bond rather than weakening it. And the reason lies deep within your brain. The brain's reward system. Our brains are wired to respond strongly to rewards. When something positive happens, like affection, praise, or physical closeness, the brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical associated with pleasure and motivation. It tells your brain, this feels good. Remember this. Seek it again. In healthy relationships, affection and connection are relatively consistent. Your nervous system remains stable. But in trauma bonds, affection becomes unpredictable. Sometimes it is there. Sometimes it disappears. And strangely enough, this unpredictability makes the reward feel even more powerful. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It is the same psychological principle used in gambling machines. When a reward appears, randomly rather than consistently, the brain becomes even more focused on trying to obtain it. You keep pulling the lever. You keep hoping the next moment will bring the reward again. In relationships, this means that unpredictable affection can create extremely strong emotional attachment. Even when the overall experience is painful, your brain begins chasing the moments of relief. And every time the other person returns, the reward system activates again, which strengthens the bond. Not because the relationship is healthy, but because your brain has been trained to crave the emotional highs. Why trauma bonds feel like destiny. One of the most confusing aspects of trauma bonds is how meaningful they can feel. The emotional intensity can be overwhelming. You may feel like this person understands you more deeply than anyone else. You may feel like the connection is unique, irreplaceable, almost magical. But much of this feeling comes from the emotional roller coaster itself. Extreme emotional experiences tend to create stronger memories. The brain remembers dramatic moments more vividly than calm ones. So the highs and lows of the relationship feel larger than life. The reconciliation moments feel like powerful proof of love. The pain feels like evidence that the connection matters deeply. And slowly, a story begins forming in your mind. Maybe this relationship is special. Maybe the struggle is part of something bigger. Maybe the universe brought you together for a reason. This is why trauma bonds are sometimes mistaken for spiritual connections. Because the emotional intensity can feel extraordinary. But intensity and health are not the same thing. A storm can feel powerful. That does not mean it is safe to live inside it. The role of emotional wounds. Another reason trauma bonds become so powerful is that they often connect to deeper emotional
wounds.
Many people who experience trauma bonds have a history of abandonment, rejection, or inconsistent love during childhood. When early relationships are unstable, the nervous system becomes highly sensitive to emotional distance. Even small signs of rejection can trigger strong fear responses. So when a partner pulls away, the anxiety can feel overwhelming. You may feel desperate to restore the connection, not just because you love the person, but because your nervous system interprets the distance as a threat. And when the partner returns, the relief feels enormous. The relationship temporarily quiets those fears. But because the cycle continues, the underlying wounds never truly heal. Instead, they remain activated again and again. This is why trauma bonds can feel so consuming. The relationship is not only about the present moment. It is also connected to unresolved emotional experiences from the past. Why leaving feels so difficult. People outside the relationship often ask a simple question. If the relationship hurts so much, why don't you just leave? But from the inside, the answer is rarely simple. Because trauma bonds create both emotional and neurological dependency. Your brain becomes accustomed to the cycle. Your emotions become tied to the hope of change. You may remember the early affectionate moments and believe they represent the person's true self. You may believe that if you just try harder, the relationship will return to how it was in the beginning. You may believe the other person is struggling with their own wounds and simply needs time to heal. These beliefs can keep people trapped in the cycle for a long time, even when the relationship repeatedly proves unstable. And sometimes, the most painful realization is this. The person you fell in love with may have only existed during the early phase of the relationship. The version of them you keep hoping will return may never fully appear again. The difference between intensity and love. One of the biggest misunderstandings in relationships is the idea that stronger emotions automatically mean deeper love. But emotional intensity can come from many sources. It can come from passion. It can come from conflict. It can come from fear of loss. It can even come from trauma. Real love, however, tends to create something different.
Stability,
Safety, respect. In healthy relationships, you may still experience disagreements or emotional challenges, but the overall environment feels secure rather than chaotic. You do not constantly feel like you might lose the person. You do not feel forced to fight for their attention. And you do not feel emotionally exhausted from trying to maintain the connection. Love should expand your sense of self, not shrink it. The first step toward clarity. Understanding trauma bonds does not mean every intense relationship is unhealthy. And it does not mean that deep spiritual connections cannot exist. What it does mean is that emotional intensity alone cannot be used as proof of destiny. The next time you think about a relationship that feels impossible to release, ask yourself something important. Is the connection helping me grow or keeping me stuck? Is the love consistent or unpredictable? Do I feel peaceful or constantly anxious? These questions may not always produce easy answers, but they open the door to awareness. And awareness is the first step toward breaking any cycle that no longer serves you. Because once you understand how trauma bonds work, the emotional fog begins to clear. And when clarity arrives, you gain something powerful. The ability to choose relationships that nurture your well-being, not just ones that overwhelm your heart. Have you ever noticed that some people seem comfortable in relationships while others constantly struggle with them? Some couples communicate easily. They trust each other. They handle disagreements without feeling like the relationship might collapse. But other relationships feel like emotional roller coasters. One partner feels anxious when the other pulls away. The other partner feels overwhelmed when the relationship becomes too intense. One person keeps chasing. The other keeps running. And the strange part is that neither person fully understands why this keeps happening. They may blame personality differences. They may assume the relationship is simply complicated. Or in spiritual communities, They may believe they are experiencing the famous runner-chaser dynamic of a twin flame connection. But long before the idea of twin flames became popular, psychologists had already been studying a pattern that looks remarkably similar.
It is called attachment theory.
And understanding it can completely change the way you see relationships. The origins of attachment theory. Attachment theory was first developed in the mid-20th century by British psychologist John Bowlby. Bowlby believed that the emotional bonds formed between children and their caregivers play a crucial role in shaping how individuals experience relationships later in life. In simple terms, the way love felt when you were very young can influence how love feels as an adult. If a child grows up with caregivers who are emotionally available, responsive, and supportive, the child often develops what psychologists call a secure attachment style. This means they learn that relationships are safe. They feel comfortable expressing emotions. They trust that others will be there for them. But when early caregiving is inconsistent, distant, or unpredictable, different attachment patterns may develop. These patterns can continue into adulthood, not because people consciously choose them, but because the nervous system learns to respond to relationships in certain ways. Over time, psychologists identified several primary attachment styles that appear frequently in adult relationships. Understanding these styles can reveal why some relationships feel balanced while others feel chaotic. The anxious attachment style. People with an anxious attachment style often crave deep emotional closeness. Connection feels extremely important to them, but at the same time, they may carry a strong fear of abandonment. Even small signs of distance can trigger anxiety. A delayed text message, a short reply, a partner asking for space. To someone with anxious attachment, these moments can feel threatening. Their mind may quickly begin asking questions. Did I say something wrong? Are they losing interest? Are they about to leave me? This anxiety can lead them to seek reassurance. They may send multiple messages. They may try harder to please their partner. They may constantly analyze the relationship for signs of rejection. From the outside, this behavior may appear overly emotional. But from the inside, it often feels like a desperate attempt to preserve the connection. Because for someone with anxious attachment, losing the relationship can feel deeply frightening. Almost like losing emotional safety itself. The avoidant attachment style. Now imagine someone with the opposite pattern. A person who values independence above all else. Someone who feels comfortable when relationships remain relaxed and low pressure. But when emotional closeness becomes intense, they start to feel overwhelmed. This is often the experience of individuals with an avoidant attachment style. For them, too much emotional closeness can feel suffocating. They may pull away when their partner expresses strong needs. They may avoid deep conversations about feelings. They may prefer to handle problems alone rather than discussing them together. From the outside, avoidant individuals may appear emotionally distant, but their behavior is often a protective response. Some grew up learning that relying on others was unreliable or unsafe. So their nervous system learned to prioritize independence. Distance becomes their way of maintaining emotional control. When anxious and avoidant styles meet. Now imagine these two attachment styles forming a relationship. One partner craves closeness and reassurance. The other partner feels overwhelmed by too much emotional intensity. The anxious partner moves closer. The avoidant partner moves away. The more one person chases connection, the more the other person feels the need for distance.
And the cycle repeats. Chase.
Retreat. Chase again. Retreat again. Over time, this dynamic can become incredibly intense. The anxious partner may feel rejected and desperate for reassurance. The avoidant partner may feel pressured and suffocated. Neither person fully understands why the relationship feels so difficult. But both continue reacting according to patterns learned long ago. And when people experiencing this dynamic discover the concept of twin flames, something interesting happens. The pattern suddenly seems to make sense. The anxious partner becomes the chaser. The avoidant partner becomes the runner. The emotional chaos becomes part of a spiritual journey. But Psychology offers a different explanation. This dynamic may not be destiny. It may simply be attachment patterns interacting with each other. Why this dynamic feels so powerful? One reason the anxious, avoidant dynamic becomes so intense is that both partners unconsciously reinforce each other's patterns. When the avoidant partner pulls away, the anxious partner feels their deepest fear being activated. So they pursue connection more intensely. But that increased pursuit makes the avoidant partner feel even more pressured, which pushes them further away. This creates an emotional loop that can continue for years. Sometimes the relationship ends. Sometimes it resumes again after a period of separation. Sometimes the cycle repeats many times. Each reunion creates hope. Each separation creates pain. And because the emotional experiences are so intense, both partners may believe the relationship must be incredibly meaningful. But emotional intensity does not always mean compatibility. Sometimes it simply means two nervous systems are triggering each other repeatedly. The illusion of the perfect match. Another reason people interpret this dynamic as a twin flame connection is the idea of mirroring. Twin flame teachings often say that each partner reflects the other's wounds. The runner mirrors fear of intimacy. The chaser mirrors fear of abandonment. In a way, this observation is not entirely wrong. Attachment theory also recognizes that relationships can activate deep emotional patterns. But there is an important difference. A healthy relationship helps both partners gradually move toward security. It encourages communication. It creates emotional safety. The anxious partner learns they are not constantly at risk of abandonment. The avoidant partner learns that intimacy does not have to feel overwhelming. Over time, both individuals grow. But in unhealthy dynamics, the opposite can happen. The anxious partner becomes more anxious. The avoidant partner becomes more distant. Instead of healing attachment wounds, the relationship repeatedly triggers them, which can make the bond feel even more powerful, while also making it more painful. The path towards secure attachment. The good news is that attachment styles are not permanent. They are patterns learned through experience. And like any pattern, they can change. Through self-awareness, emotional healing, and healthy relationships, many people gradually develop secure attachment. Secure attachment does not mean relationships are always perfect. It simply means both partners feel safe expressing their needs. They trust each other's intentions. They can handle distance without assuming abandonment. And they can handle closeness without feeling overwhelmed. In secure relationships, love does not feel like a constant battle. It feels stable, grounded, supportive. And perhaps most importantly, it allows both individuals to remain fully themselves. Understanding your own patterns. Before labeling any relationship as destiny or twin flame connection, it can be incredibly valuable to ask a more personal question. What attachment patterns do I bring into relationships? Do I tend to feel anxious when someone pulls away? Do I feel uncomfortable when someone wants deeper emotional closeness? Do I chase love or avoid it? These questions are not about blame. They are about awareness. Because the more you understand your own attachment patterns, the easier it becomes to recognize when a relationship is helping you grow and when it is simply repeating old emotional cycles. And sometimes, the greatest transformation does not come from finding the perfect partner. It comes from understanding yourself. Because when you begin healing your own attachment patterns, something powerful happens. You stop chasing connections that recreate old wounds. And you begin attracting relationships that feel calmer, healthier, and more genuine. Which leads us to the next important question. If trauma bonds and attachment patterns can create relationships that feel intensely meaningful, then how can we recognize the difference between a toxic connection and a true twin flame relationship? That is exactly what we will explore next. Why do so many people believe they have met their twin flame only to later realize the relationship was deeply unhealthy? Why do relationships that cause so much confusion and emotional pain still feel like destiny? And perhaps the most important question of all, why does it feel so difficult to tell the difference? To answer these questions, we need to look closely at the emotional experience itself. Because trauma bonds and the popular description of twin flame connections share several striking similarities. On the surface, they can feel almost identical. Both can create overwhelming attraction. Both can make someone feel like they have found the one. Both can involve separation, reunion, and intense emotional transformation. But while the experiences may look similar from the outside, the underlying forces are very different. Understanding these differences can help reveal why trauma bonds are so often mistaken for spiritual connections. The illusion of instant recognition. One of the most common descriptions of a twin flame meeting is the feeling of instant recognition. People often say that when they first met their twin flame, something felt immediately familiar. They may describe it as feeling like they had known the person forever, like meeting someone who understands them at the deepest level. This experience can feel incredibly powerful, but intense emotional recognition can also happen for psychological reasons. Sometimes we feel strongly drawn to people who trigger familiar emotional patterns from our past. If someone reminds us, consciously or unconsciously, of emotional dynamics we experienced earlier in life, our nervous system may react with immediate intensity. The person may feel strangely familiar, even if we cannot explain why. This familiarity does not necessarily mean the connection is spiritual. It may simply mean that the relationship activates emotional patterns that already exist within us. In other words, the sense of recognition may come from unresolved emotional memories rather than a soul-level reunion. The power of emotional intensity. Another reason trauma bonds can resemble twin flame relationships is the sheer emotional intensity
Involved.
Many people believe that if a relationship feels powerful enough, it must be meaningful. After all, ordinary connections do not produce the same overwhelming emotions. The constant thoughts, the sleepless nights, the longing that refuses to disappear. When someone occupies that much space in your mind, it is easy to assume the connection must be extraordinary. But emotional intensity is not always a sign of deep love. Sometimes it is a sign of emotional instability. Trauma bonds create a powerful emotional roller coaster. One moment you feel deeply loved. The next moment you feel rejected or abandoned. Your emotional state becomes closely tied to the other person's behavior. And because the relationship swings between extreme highs and extreme lows, your nervous system remains in a heightened state of alert. That heightened emotional state can make the connection feel larger than life, almost mythical. But intensity alone does not mean the relationship is healthy. Sometimes the strongest emotional reactions come from the most unstable environments. The hope of reunion. Another major similarity between trauma bonds and twin flame narratives is the idea of separation, followed by reunion. Many twin flame teachings describe a period of distance where the two partners must grow individually before coming back together. This idea can feel comforting when a relationship becomes unstable. If the other person disappears or pulls away, it does not necessarily mean the relationship is over. Instead, it may simply mean the connection is entering the separation stage. The hope of eventual reunion becomes a powerful emotional anchor. People hold on to the belief that the distance is temporary, that growth is happening behind the scenes, that the universe will bring them back together at the right moment. But trauma bonds also create cycles of separation and reunion. The partner may leave, then return, then disappear again. Each return reinforces hope that the relationship is improving, even if the underlying behavior never truly changes. This pattern can continue for months or even years. The brain becomes conditioned to expect reconciliation after each painful separation, and each reunion strengthens the emotional attachment further. From the outside, it can look like destiny pulling two people back together. But from a psychological perspective, it may simply be a cycle of emotional dependency. The role of synchronicities. Another reason trauma bonds can feel spiritual is the presence of meaningful coincidences. Many people on the twin flame journey describe experiencing synchronicities. They may see repeating numbers, dream about the person unexpectedly, Think about the moments before receiving a message. These experiences can feel almost mystical. They reinforce the belief that the connection is guided by a larger force. But human perception naturally looks for patterns. When someone occupies a large part of your emotional world, your brain becomes highly sensitive to anything related to them. You notice their name more often. You notice reminders of them in music, conversations, or social media. Moments that might normally go unnoticed suddenly feel significant. This does not necessarily mean the experiences are meaningless. Human intuition can be powerful, but it does mean that psychological factors can amplify the sense of synchronicity, especially when strong emotions are involved. The desire for meaning. Perhaps the deepest reason trauma bonds are mistaken for twin flame connections is our natural desire to find meaning in emotional pain. When a relationship hurts deeply, the mind searches for explanations. Why did this happen? Why does it feel so intense? Why can't I let go? If the answer is simply that the relationship was unhealthy, that explanation can feel unsatisfying. It offers no grand narrative, no sense of purpose, no promise that the pain will lead to something beautiful. But the twin flame story provides exactly that. It transforms emotional chaos into a spiritual journey. The heartbreak becomes part of awakening. The separation becomes part of transformation. The longing becomes proof of an eternal bond. This narrative can feel incredibly comforting. It allows people to believe that their suffering has meaning. But there is also a risk. If the story becomes too powerful, it can prevent people from recognizing when a relationship is harming them. Instead of asking whether the connection is healthy, they ask only whether it is destined. And sometimes, that question keeps them trapped in cycles that are difficult to escape. The subtle difference between growth and harm. It is important to acknowledge that meaningful relationships can indeed challenge us. Even healthy partnerships may bring up insecurities or emotional wounds that need healing. Growth is rarely comfortable. But there is a difference between growth that strengthens you and pain that diminishes you. In a healthy connection, even one that feels spiritually significant, you gradually become more stable, not less. You gain clarity rather than confusion. You feel supported rather than constantly uncertain. In trauma bonds, the opposite often happens. The relationship becomes increasingly chaotic. Your sense of self may begin to shrink. You may spend more time analyzing the other person's behavior than focusing on your own growth. And instead of feeling empowered, you may feel emotionally dependent on their presence. These differences can be subtle at first, but over time, they become more visible, which is why learning to recognize them is so important. Looking beyond the story. At the end of the day, the human heart loves stories. Stories of destiny. Stories of cosmic love. Stories of two souls finding their way back to each other despite impossible odds. And sometimes those stories may be true, but sometimes the truth is simpler. Two people met. They triggered powerful emotional patterns in each other. The relationship became intense, confusing, and difficult to leave. Understanding this possibility does not make the experience less meaningful. It simply brings clarity. Because when you stop focusing only on the story of the connection, you begin paying attention to how the relationship actually affects your life. Does it help you grow? Does it bring peace? Does it support your well-being? Or does it keep you stuck in cycles of hope and heartbreak? These questions may not always be easy to answer, but they are essential. Because before we can truly understand the difference between trauma bonds and genuine spiritual connections, we must first learn to look beyond the intensity of the experience. And in the next chapter, we will explore what many people believe are the true characteristics of a healthy twin flame connection and how those characteristics differ from toxic dynamics. After exploring trauma bonds, attachment patterns, and the psychology behind intense relationships, a natural question arises. If some connections that feel destined are actually trauma bonds, then what does a genuine twin flame connection look like? Is there any real difference? Or are all intense relationships simply psychological dynamics disguised as spirituality? The truth is more nuanced. Many people who believe in twin flames describe experiences that genuinely transform their lives. These relationships often inspire deep self-reflection. They push individuals to heal long-standing emotional wounds. They trigger profound personal growth. But the key difference between a meaningful spiritual connection and a toxic dynamic lies in the direction the relationship pushes your life.
Does it expand you?
Or does it slowly break you down? Because even if a relationship is spiritually significant, it should never destroy your sense of self. And this distinction becomes clearer when we examine the qualities often associated with healthy twin flame connections. Growth instead of emotional destruction. One of the most widely discussed aspects of twin flame relationships is the idea that they trigger personal growth. Many people report that meeting their twin flame forced them to confront parts of themselves they had avoided for years. Old insecurities surface. Past wounds become visible. Unresolved emotional patterns rise to the surface. This process can be uncomfortable, sometimes deeply uncomfortable. But the purpose of that discomfort is not endless suffering. The purpose is awareness. In a genuine growth-oriented connection, emotional challenges eventually lead to healing. Both individuals gradually become more self-aware. They begin to take responsibility for their emotional patterns. They work on improving communication and emotional maturity. Over time, the relationship becomes less chaotic, not more. If a relationship continues producing the same painful patterns without meaningful change, something important is missing. Growth requires evolution. Without evolution, the cycle simply becomes repetition. Mutual transformation. Another characteristic often associated with healthy twin flame connections is mutual transformation. Both individuals grow. Both individuals change. Both individuals become more conscious of their emotional behavior. In toxic relationships, growth tends to be one-sided. One partner may do all the emotional work while the other continues repeating harmful patterns. But in a balanced spiritual connection, both people gradually become more responsible for their actions. Both recognize the need to heal their own wounds. Both work toward becoming better versions of themselves. This mutual transformation is what allows the relationship to evolve beyond its early intensity. Instead of remaining trapped in conflict or separation, the connection begins to stabilize. Respect increases. Communication improves. Emotional maturity deepens. The relationship becomes a space where both individuals support each other's development rather than draining each other's energy. Respect for boundaries. Another important difference between healthy connections and trauma bonds is the presence of boundaries. In unhealthy relationships, boundaries are often ignored or violated. One partner may manipulate emotions. Pressure may replace respect. Communication may become inconsistent or deceptive. But in healthy spiritual relationships, boundaries are not seen as threats. They are seen as necessary parts of emotional well-being. Both partners understand that personal growth sometimes requires space. They respect each other's independence. They allow each other time to heal without creating guilt or emotional pressure. This mutual respect creates a foundation of trust. Without boundaries, emotional chaos quickly takes over. But when boundaries are honored, the relationship becomes more stable and supportive. Emotional safety. Another essential quality often overlooked in romanticized descriptions of twin flame relationships is emotional safety. Many people assume that powerful spiritual connections must be dramatic or painful. But emotional safety is actually one of the strongest indicators of a healthy bond. In a safe relationship, you can express your thoughts without fear of punishment or rejection. You can discuss problems without worrying that the entire relationship will collapse. You can share vulnerabilities knowing that they will be met with understanding rather than judgment. Emotional safety does not mean there are never disagreements. Conflict exists in every relationship, but the way conflict is handled makes all the difference. In emotionally safe relationships, disagreements become opportunities for understanding rather than weapons for control. Both partners aim to resolve problems rather than win arguments. Over time, this creates a deeper level of trust. And trust is the foundation of any lasting connection. Independence within connection. Another sign of a healthy connection, whether spiritual or not, is the ability to maintain independence. Trauma bonds often create emotional dependency. One partner may feel unable to function without the other. Their mood may depend entirely on the other person's attention. Their sense of self may begin to revolve around the relationship. But in balanced connections, both individuals maintain their own identity. They have personal goals. They pursue their own interests. They cultivate friendships and passions outside the relationship. The relationship becomes an addition to their life rather than the center of their entire identity. Ironically, this independence often strengthens the bond. Because both individuals choose to be together rather than feeling trapped by emotional need. Love becomes a choice, not a necessity for survival. Stability over time. Perhaps one of the clearest ways to distinguish between healthy spiritual connections and trauma bonds is to observe the relationship over time. Early intensity does not necessarily determine the long-term nature of the connection. What matters more is how the relationship evolves. Does the chaos eventually settle into stability? Do communication patterns improve? Do both individuals demonstrate emotional growth? Or does the relationship remain trapped in the same cycle of confusion, separation, and reconciliation? Healthy connections tend to become calmer as time passes. The emotional highs and lows begin to stabilize. Trust gradually replaces uncertainty. Partners feel more secure rather than more anxious. If a relationship continues to feel unpredictable year after year, it may not be a sign of spiritual depth. It may simply be a sign that the underlying dynamic has not changed. The role of spiritual meaning. Many people describe twin flame connections as spiritually meaningful. And there is nothing inherently wrong with interpreting relationships through a spiritual lens. Human experiences often carry layers of emotional and symbolic meaning. But spirituality should never be used as an excuse for unhealthy behavior. No spiritual concept should justify emotional manipulation, disrespect, or psychological harm. True spiritual growth encourages compassion, accountability, and self-awareness. It invites people to become more responsible for their actions, not less. A connection that inspires both partners to become kinder, wiser, and more self-aware may indeed carry profound significance. But a connection that repeatedly damages emotional well-being deserves careful examination. The real purpose of deep connections. Whether someone believes in twin flames or not, one truth remains clear. Some relationships change us deeply. They reveal parts of ourselves we did not know existed. They challenge our fears. They expand our understanding of love. But the ultimate purpose of any meaningful connection should be growth. Not suffering without end. Not confusion that never resolves. Not emotional exhaustion disguised as destiny. True connection should gradually move us toward greater clarity, self-respect, and emotional freedom. And when a relationship consistently moves us in that direction, it becomes something truly valuable. Whether we call it love, partnership, or even a twin flame connection. But recognizing this difference requires honesty. And sometimes, the most honest question we can ask is not whether the connection feels powerful, but whether it actually makes our lives healthier and more whole. Because the next step in understanding these dynamics is learning how to evaluate a relationship
Clearly.
how to step back from emotional intensity long enough to ask the most important questions. Questions that reveal whether a connection is helping you grow or quietly holding you back. And that is exactly what we will explore next. Sometimes the most powerful way to understand the difference between a trauma bond and a healthy soul connection is through stories. Because on the surface, both types of relationships can look remarkably similar. They can begin with intense attraction. They can create emotional transformation. They can involve separation and longing. But as time unfolds, the direction of the relationship begins to reveal its true nature. To understand this difference, let's look at two fictional stories. At first, they may sound almost identical, but by the end, their paths become very different. Story 1. The Endless Cycle. When Sarah first met Daniel, she felt something she had never experienced before. It was immediate, powerful, almost overwhelming. They met through mutual friends at a small gathering, and from the moment they started talking, the conversation felt effortless. Hours passed without either of them noticing. They talked about childhood memories, personal struggles, dreams about the future. Daniel seemed to understand Sarah in a way no one else ever had. Within weeks, the relationship became intense. They spent nearly every day together. They texted constantly. Sarah felt like she had finally found someone who truly saw her, someone who understood her deepest emotions. But after a few months, something began to change. Daniel started becoming distant. Messages that once came instantly now took hours, or sometimes days. Plans were canceled without explanation. When Sarah asked if something was wrong, Daniel would reassure her, "I just need space. Work has been stressful. You're overthinking things." Sarah tried to believe him, but the uncertainty made her anxious. The more distant Daniel became, the more Sarah tried to reconnect. She sent longer messages. She tried harder to be understanding. She convinced herself that if she was patient enough, things would return to how they were in the beginning. Then one day, Daniel disappeared completely. No messages. No explanation. Days turned into weeks. Sarah felt devastated. But just as she began trying to move forward, Daniel suddenly returned. He apologized. He said he had been overwhelmed. He told her she meant everything to him. And the moment Sarah heard his voice again, all the pain seemed to fade. The connection felt even stronger than before. For a while, everything seemed perfect again, until the distance returned. And the cycle repeated. Separation, reunion, hope, disappointment. Year after year, Sarah continued believing the relationship was destined. She read about twin flames and saw her experience reflected in the descriptions. Runner and chaser. Separation and reunion. Spiritual growth through emotional struggle. It all seemed to make sense. But something else was also happening. Sarah's life slowly began shrinking. She spent more time analyzing Daniel's behavior than pursuing her own dreams. Her happiness became dependent on whether he was present or absent. And despite the powerful emotions between them, the relationship never truly evolved. The cycle continued, over and over again, until Sarah finally realized something difficult. The connection felt powerful, but it was not helping either of them grow. Story 2. The Difficult Mirror. Now consider a different story. When Michael met Elena, the connection also felt intense. Their conversations were deep. Their emotional chemistry was undeniable. Both felt as if they had known each other much longer than they actually had. But unlike Sarah and Daniel's relationship, this connection quickly revealed deeper challenges. Both Michael and Elena carried unresolved emotional wounds. Michael struggled with vulnerability. Opening up emotionally made him uncomfortable. Elena, on the other hand, often feared abandonment. She sometimes worried that people she loved would eventually leave. As their relationship deepened, these patterns began to appear. When Elena expressed strong emotions, Michael sometimes withdrew. When Michael pulled away, Elena felt anxious. The tension between closeness and distance created conflict. Eventually, the relationship reached a breaking point. They decided to separate. At first, the separation felt painful. Both missed each other deeply. But instead of remaining trapped in the cycle of chasing and running, something different happened. Both began focusing on their own healing. Michael started therapy to understand why emotional closeness felt threatening. Elena began working on her fear of abandonment and learning to create emotional security within herself. For the first time, both individuals took responsibility for their own growth. Months passed. Then more time passed. Their lives continued moving forward. Neither spent their days waiting for the other to return. Instead, they focused on becoming healthier versions of themselves. Years later, their paths crossed again. When they met again, something had changed. The emotional intensity was still there, but the dynamic was different. There was more calm, more clarity, more respect. They communicated more openly. They understood their patterns better. And this time, the relationship did not fall into the same cycle. It evolved,
Slowly.
naturally, into something healthier. The subtle difference. At the beginning, both stories looked similar. Two people met and experienced powerful emotional attraction. Both relationships included separation. Both involved deep feelings and longing. But the direction of each story was completely different. In the first story, the emotional cycle repeated without meaningful change. The intensity remained high, but growth remained limited. The relationship consumed Sarah's emotional energy without helping her evolve. In the second story, the separation created space for healing. Both individuals used the experience to understand themselves better. When the relationship eventually returned, it did so in a healthier form. This difference reveals something important. Not every intense connection is meant to continue forever. Sometimes the true purpose of a relationship is simply to teach us something, to reveal emotional patterns we need to heal, to show us where our boundaries need strengthening. And sometimes, growth requires letting go. Why it's so hard to see clearly. The challenge is that when we are inside a powerful emotional experience, clarity can be difficult. Hope often overrides logic. Memories of the early connection keep us believing that things will return to how they once felt. And the fear of losing something special can make it hard to accept reality. But time has a way of revealing patterns. When we step back and observe how a relationship evolves over months or years, the direction becomes clearer. Is the connection helping both people grow? Or is it repeating the same emotional cycle again and again? Is there progress? Or only intensity? These questions do not always produce immediate answers, but they offer something incredibly valuable: perspective. And sometimes perspective is exactly what we need to understand whether a relationship is guiding us forward or quietly keeping us stuck in the past. In the next chapter, we will explore a set of questions that can help you evaluate your own relationship more clearly. Questions that reveal whether the connection you are experiencing is helping you grow or slowly draining your emotional energy. When you are inside an intense relationship, clarity can be surprisingly difficult. Emotions blur your perspective. Memories of the good moments keep hope alive. And the fear of losing someone important can make it almost impossible to step back and evaluate the connection objectively. This is why many people remain in confusing relationship dynamics for years. Not because they lack intelligence or self-awareness, but because emotional attachment can cloud even the most rational thinking. One moment you feel certain the connection is extraordinary. The next moment you question whether the relationship is harming you. The mind goes back and forth, hope and doubt constantly competing with each other. So, how do you find clarity when your emotions are deeply involved? Sometimes the most helpful approach is not searching for mystical signs or external validation. Instead, it is asking yourself honest questions. Questions that cut through emotional intensity and reveal how the relationship is actually affecting your life. These questions are not meant to judge your experience. They are meant to help you see it more clearly. Question 1. Do I feel peaceful or constantly anxious? One of the most important indicators of a healthy relationship is the overall emotional atmosphere it creates. Do you feel calm when you think about this person? Or do you feel a constant sense of uncertainty? Many people caught in trauma bonds describe a persistent emotional tension. They check their phone frequently, hoping for a message. They analyze every interaction. They worry about saying the wrong thing. Their emotional state rises and falls depending on the other person's attention. In contrast, healthy connections tend to create a sense of stability. Even when challenges appear, the overall feeling remains grounded. You may still experience excitement, passion, and emotional depth, but underneath those emotions, there is a foundation of security. You do not constantly wonder where you stand. You do not feel like the relationship could disappear at any moment. Peace does not mean the relationship is boring. It simply means that emotional safety exists. And emotional safety is one of the clearest signs that a relationship is supportive rather than destabilizing. Question 2. Do they respect my boundaries? Boundaries are essential for any healthy relationship. They define what behaviors feel acceptable and what behaviors do not. They protect your emotional well-being. They allow both partners to maintain their sense of self. But in many unhealthy dynamics, boundaries slowly disappear. You may find yourself tolerating behavior that once felt unacceptable. You may accept long periods of silence. You may overlook broken promises. You may convince yourself that patience and understanding will eventually solve the problem. But respect for boundaries is not something that should appear only occasionally. It should be consistent. A partner who genuinely values you will respect your emotional limits. They will communicate honestly. They will make an effort to repair conflicts rather than ignoring them. If you repeatedly feel that your needs are dismissed or minimized, that is an important signal. Because love without respect is not sustainable. And no spiritual narrative should require you to tolerate behavior that harms your well-being. Question 3. Am I growing or losing myself? Relationships can influence personal growth in powerful ways. A healthy connection often inspires people to become more self-aware, more compassionate, more confident in their ability to communicate honestly. But unhealthy relationships can produce the opposite effect. Instead of expanding your life, they begin to shrink it. You may spend less time focusing on your own goals. You may become more preoccupied with the other person's behavior than your own development. Your emotional energy becomes consumed by the relationship. Slowly, without realizing it, your identity begins to revolve around the connection. Your happiness depends on whether the other person is present or absent. Your sense of purpose becomes tied to fixing the relationship. But healthy love should not require sacrificing your identity. It should encourage your individuality. It should support your dreams. It should make your world larger, not smaller. When evaluating a relationship, it is helpful to ask yourself a simple question. Has my life expanded since meeting this person, or has it gradually become more limited? The answer can reveal more than any external sign. Question 4. Do our conflicts lead to growth? Every relationship includes conflict. Disagreements are a natural part of human interaction. What matters is not whether conflict exists, but how it is handled. In healthy relationships, conflicts often lead to deeper understanding. Both partners eventually communicate their perspectives. They listen to each other. They work together to improve the situation. Even difficult conversations become opportunities for growth. But in unhealthy dynamics, conflict rarely resolves anything. Arguments repeat the same themes. Misunderstandings remain unresolved. Communication breaks down completely. Sometimes one partner simply disappears rather than addressing the problem. And when reconciliation occurs, the underlying issues remain unchanged. The relationship resets temporarily, only for the same problems to reappear later. Over time, this pattern creates emotional exhaustion, because the relationship never truly evolves. When evaluating a connection, it is worth asking, do our challenges bring us closer to understanding each other? Or do they keep repeating without resolution? Growth requires change. Without change, conflict becomes a loop rather than a lesson. Question 5. If I removed the label, would I still stay? This may be the most revealing question of all. Imagine removing every spiritual label associated with the relationship. No twin flame concept. No idea of destiny. No belief that the universe brought you together. If the connection were simply two people interacting, without any cosmic explanation, would you still choose this relationship? Would you still accept the same behavior? Would you still feel that the connection supports your well-being? For some people, the answer remains yes. Even without spiritual labels, the relationship still feels meaningful, respectful, and nurturing. But for others, the answer becomes more complicated. Without the story of destiny, the relationship may begin to look very different. It may appear less like a sacred journey and more like a cycle of emotional instability. This question is not meant to invalidate spiritual beliefs. It is meant to reveal whether the connection itself is healthy. Because if a relationship only makes sense when framed as destiny, that may be worth examining carefully. The courage to see clearly. Asking these questions requires honesty, and honesty can be uncomfortable. Sometimes the answers confirm that a relationship truly supports your growth. Other times they reveal patterns that need attention. But clarity is not something to fear. Clarity is what allows you to make conscious choices about your life. It gives you the power to protect your emotional well-being. It allows you to pursue connections that genuinely support your happiness. And, perhaps most importantly, clarity reminds you that your worth is not defined by whether someone else chooses to stay or leave. You deserve relationships that respect you, that communicate honestly, that encourage your personal growth. Whether someone believes in twin flames or not, these principles remain essential. Love should not feel like a constant test of endurance. It should feel like a partnership in becoming better human beings. And, in the final chapter, we will explore a deeper truth that often emerges after people ask these questions. Sometimes the most powerful spiritual lesson is not about holding on to someone forever. Sometimes the real lesson is learning when to let go, and discovering that doing so can open the door to a completely new kind of freedom. There is a truth rarely spoken about in the twin flame journey. A truth that many people avoid because it challenges the fantasy of immediate reunion. Before union, there is healing. Before harmony, there is confrontation with the deepest parts of yourself. And before two souls can truly come together, both must first become whole. Because the real twin flame journey is not about chasing another person. It is about awakening yourself. The illusion of reunion. Many people enter the twin flame path believing that reunion is the final goal. They imagine a moment when the separation ends, when the runner returns, when everything finally becomes peaceful. But the journey rarely unfolds that way. Instead, many discover something unexpected. The more they chase reunion, the more distant it becomes.
Why?
Because the twin flame connection is not designed to reward pursuit. It is designed to trigger transformation. If one person is still seeking validation, reassurance, or emotional completion from the other, the energetic balance is not ready. In other words, union cannot happen from a place of need. It can only happen from a place of wholeness. And that is why healing always comes first. The mirror effect. One of the most powerful dynamics in the twin flame connection is the mirror effect. Your twin flame reflects not only your strengths and beauty, but also your wounds. Every insecurity, every unresolved trauma, every fear of abandonment, all of it becomes visible, sometimes painfully so. This is why the connection can feel overwhelming. One moment you feel profound love. The next moment you feel intense emotional triggers. It may feel confusing, even contradictory. But the purpose is not to cause suffering. The purpose is awareness. The mirror simply reveals what already exists within you. And once you see it clearly, healing becomes possible. The healing journey. Healing on the twin flame path is rarely comfortable. It requires confronting patterns that may have existed for years, sometimes even decades. Patterns such as fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. Many of these patterns originate long before the twin flame ever appears. Often they begin in childhood. A parent who was emotionally distant. A relationship that ended in betrayal. Moments when love felt conditional rather than safe. These experiences shape our attachment patterns and emotional responses. And when the twin flame connection activates them, it can feel like everything is unraveling at once. But this unraveling is not destruction. It is transformation. Because the parts of you that once operated unconsciously are now being brought into the light. From chasing to self-discovery. At the beginning of the twin flame journey, many people fall into the chaser role. They feel a powerful longing to reconnect. They replay memories. They analyze every message, every silence, every possible sign. Their world becomes centered around one question. Will we reunite? But as healing begins, something remarkable happens. The focus slowly shifts. Instead of asking when the reunion will happen, they begin asking deeper questions. Why did this connection trigger me so deeply? What wounds within me need attention? What parts of myself have I neglected? And as these questions unfold, the energy changes. The desperate need for answers begins to dissolve. In its place, a new sense of clarity appears. Because the journey was never about chasing someone else. It was always about discovering yourself. The power of self-love. One of the greatest lessons of the twin flame path is learning self-love. Not the superficial version often discussed in motivational quotes, but real self-love. The kind that requires honesty. The kind that asks you to sit with your pain instead of running from it. To forgive yourself for past mistakes. To release the belief that you must earn love through sacrifice or suffering. For many people, this stage is transformative. They begin setting boundaries where they once tolerated mistreatment. They start choosing peace instead of chaos. They realize that love should never require abandoning themselves. And as this self-love grows, something powerful occurs. Their energy changes. They become calmer, more grounded, less reactive, less attached to outcomes. Ironically, this is often the moment when the twin flame dynamic shifts. Not because they chased harder, but because they finally stopped chasing at all. The paradox of letting go. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the twin flame journey is letting go. Many people believe letting go means giving up. But in truth, letting go means releasing control. It means trusting that what is meant for you will align naturally. Letting go does not mean forgetting the connection. It means freeing yourself from obsession and attachment. Instead of trying to force reunion, you allow life to unfold. You focus on growth, purpose,
Peace.
and sometimes something surprising happens. The moment you stop chasing, the dynamic begins to shift. The runner may feel the energetic change. Communication may reopen. Circumstances may realign. But even if none of that happens immediately, something far more valuable has already occurred. You have reclaimed your power. When both souls heal. A true twin flame union cannot exist if only one person is growing. Both individuals must confront their wounds. Both must mature emotionally. Both must learn self-awareness. Otherwise, the connection remains unstable. Think of it like two mirrors facing each other. If one mirror is clear but the other is distorted, the reflection will never fully stabilize. But when both mirrors become clear, something extraordinary happens. The reflection becomes harmonious. This is why twin flame unions sometimes occur years after the initial meeting. Not because the connection disappeared, but because both people needed time to evolve. Healing takes time. Growth takes patience. And spiritual transformation cannot be rushed. The quiet stage of peace. Many people describe a surprising stage that occurs after deep healing. A stage of quiet. The emotional storms fade. The obsessive thoughts disappear. And instead of constant longing, there is peace. This stage can feel strange at first. Some even wonder if the connection has faded. But often, the opposite is true. The connection has simply become calmer, more balanced, because it is no longer driven by wounds. Instead, it exists in a space of quiet awareness.
You know the bond exists.
But it no longer controls your life. And in that stillness, something beautiful becomes possible. Authentic union. The truth about reunion. Reunion is often portrayed as a magical moment when everything suddenly becomes perfect. But the real truth is far more profound. Reunion is not a reward. It is a reflection. A reflection of two people who have done the inner work. Two people who have faced their shadows. Two people who have learned to love themselves fully. Only then can they love each other without fear, without control, without emotional dependency. And when that happens, the connection transforms from intensity into harmony, from chaos into stability, from longing into peace. If you are on the twin flame journey, you may sometimes wonder why it feels so difficult. Why the connection awakened so many emotions. Why the path required so much healing. But perhaps the real question is this. What if the connection was never meant to complete you? What if it was meant to awaken you? Because the most powerful transformation in this journey is not reunion. It is becoming the person you were always meant to be.
Whole.
Self-aware.
At peace.
And when two souls reach that place, union no longer feels like a desperate hope. It simply becomes the natural next step. Or sometimes, the quiet confirmation that the journey has already fulfilled its purpose. If this message resonated with your journey, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else who is walking the same path right now. And remember, the twin flame journey is not about losing yourself in another person. It is about finding yourself and discovering the kind of love that begins within. After everything we have explored in this journey, there remains one final question. A question that many people are afraid to ask themselves. Is this truly a twin flame connection? Or is it something else entirely? Is it a soul-level bond designed to awaken you? Or a trauma bond that keeps you trapped in emotional cycles? This question matters more than most people realize, because the difference between these two experiences can shape the course of your emotional life, your healing, and your future relationships. And the answer is rarely as simple as we hope. Why this question is so difficult? When someone experiences an intense emotional connection, the mind naturally searches for meaning. We want to believe that the intensity must represent something extraordinary. After all, if a relationship feels overwhelming, magnetic, and unforgettable, it must be special, right? But intensity alone does not define spiritual truth. In fact, trauma bonds can feel just as powerful as soul connections. Both can involve deep emotional highs, painful separations, constant thinking about the other person, a sense of being unable to let go. From the inside, the two experiences can feel almost identical. This is why so many people struggle to tell the difference. The heart feels convinced, but the deeper question remains. Is this connection helping you grow or slowly breaking you down? The core difference: expansion versus entrapment. One of the most reliable ways to understand the nature of a connection is to observe its long-term impact. Not the excitement of the beginning, not the intensity of the chase, but the overall direction of your life while you are in it. A true twin flame journey, though challenging, ultimately leads to expansion. It pushes you towards self-awareness, healing, and personal growth. Even during separation, something inside you begins evolving. You start questioning old patterns. You become more conscious of your emotional wounds. You grow. A trauma bond, however, works in the opposite direction. Instead of expansion, it creates entrapment. The relationship becomes a cycle of emotional dependency. Moments of affection are followed by distance. Kindness is followed by coldness. And the unpredictability keeps you emotionally hooked. You are not growing. You are surviving. And the longer the cycle continues, the harder it becomes to leave. The illusion of spiritual justification. One of the most dangerous aspects of trauma bonds in the twin flame community is spiritual justification. When people believe they have met their twin flame, they sometimes tolerate behaviors that would otherwise be recognized as unhealthy. They may say things like, "This pain is part of the spiritual journey." They are running because they are afraid of the connection. Our souls are meant to be together, even if it hurts. But spiritual labels can sometimes hide painful truths. A relationship that consistently involves manipulation, disrespect, emotional neglect, or abuse cannot be justified by spiritual concepts. No soul connection requires you to abandon your self-worth. No spiritual path demands that you accept mistreatment. Real spiritual growth always includes one essential element: respect for yourself. Questions that reveal the truth. Sometimes clarity comes not from answers, but from the right questions. If you are uncertain about your connection, consider asking yourself the following. Do I feel emotionally safe with this person? Do they take responsibility for their actions? Does this relationship encourage me to grow and heal? Or does it keep reopening the same wounds over and over again? Am I becoming stronger as a result of this connection? Or am I becoming smaller, more anxious, and more dependent? These questions can be uncomfortable, but they reveal something important. Love should never require losing yourself. The role of attachment styles. Another important factor in understanding these connections is attachment style. Attachment styles are patterns formed early in life that influence how we relate to others. Some people develop secure attachment, where intimacy feels safe and stable. Others develop anxious attachment, where they fear abandonment and seek constant reassurance. And some develop avoidant attachment, where emotional closeness feels overwhelming. In many trauma bonds, anxious and avoidant patterns collide. One person constantly pursues closeness. The other pulls away whenever things become too intense. This creates a cycle that feels strangely similar to the classic twin flame runner and chaser dynamic. But the motivation behind the behavior is different. In trauma bonds, the pattern is driven by unresolved psychological wounds. In genuine spiritual connections, the separation periods usually trigger healing rather than prolonged emotional harm. The key difference is growth. When healing becomes the priority, at some point in the journey, many people reach a moment of realization. They stop asking whether the other person will return, and instead they ask a more powerful question. What do I need to heal within myself? This shift changes everything. Because the moment you prioritize your healing, the power of trauma bonds begins to weaken. You start setting boundaries. You stop tolerating behaviors that once seemed unavoidable. You begin reclaiming your emotional independence. And something remarkable happens. The fog clears. Whether the connection was a twin flame journey or a trauma bond becomes easier to understand. Because when you are grounded in self-respect, the truth becomes visible. The courage to walk away. Perhaps the hardest part of this realization is accepting that not every intense connection is meant
To last.
Some people enter our lives to awaken us, not to stay forever. They reveal our wounds. They trigger our growth. They force us to confront parts of ourselves we might otherwise ignore. But their role may end once the lesson is learned. Letting go of such a connection can feel heartbreaking, especially if you believed it was destined. But sometimes the most spiritual decision you can make is choosing peace over attachment. Choosing your healing over emotional chaos. Choosing a future where love feels safe, mutual, and nourishing. The possibility of real love. One of the greatest fears people experience after leaving a trauma bond is this. What if I never feel that intensity again? But intensity and love are not the same thing. True love often feels calmer, safer, more stable. It does not rely on emotional roller coasters. It grows slowly through trust and consistency. And while it may not create the same dramatic highs and lows, it offers something far more valuable.
Peace.
A love that supports your well-being. A love that allows you to be fully yourself. In the end, the question of twin flame or trauma bond may not be the most important one. Because regardless of the label, the real purpose of every meaningful connection is growth. Some relationships teach us how to love. Others teach us how to protect ourselves. Both are part of the human journey. What matters most is what you become because of the experience. Do you emerge wiser, stronger, more aware of your worth? If the answer is yes, then the journey has already fulfilled its purpose. A message for your journey. If you are currently questioning a connection in your life, remember this. You deserve a love that expands you, not one that traps you. You deserve a connection that honors your growth, not one that feeds your wounds. And, most importantly, you deserve peace. Sometimes the most spiritual act is not chasing a connection. It is choosing yourself. If this video helped you reflect on your own journey, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Because the path to true love, whether with another person or within yourself, always begins with awareness.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.